Welcome everyone. My name is Lloyd and I'll be your moderator during this session today. I'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chat box, so feel free to ask any questions during or after this presentation. The presentation you're about to see is pre-recorded and Peter will be live after the presentation to answer any questions you have. Okay, let's get started.
Hi everyone, welcome to New Zealand's contribution to the community stream of HL7 FHIR DevDays with a presentation, somewhat unsurprisingly, called New Zealand on Fire. I'm Peter Jordan, the chair of HL7 New Zealand. I live in Hamilton on the North Island. I'm a solution architect and I'm currently the co-chair of HL7's International Council, an affiliate director on the board and a co-chair of the SNOMED on Fire group. My presentation is going to be in 6 main parts, starting off with a brief introduction to New Zealand, followed by the foundations of fire adoption and usage in New Zealand, a look at where we are now in this regard, and then the use of fire in the National Health Interoperability Platform project called NHIP, a recently published Interoperability Roadmap, and some lessons learned to date in fire implementation and adoption in New Zealand. We're the land of the long white cloud. Aotearoa is the Te Rauā Maori name for New Zealand. We consist of 3 main islands, north and south. Well, the West Island could also be called Australia, I guess. First settled 800 years ago by Maori, the population is 5 million people and roughly 35 million sheep. We're the 3rd oldest HL7 affiliate, formed in 1996. We attended the first ever Fire Connectathon back in Baltimore 2012 or 2011, I think. And Graham Grieve, the founder of Fire, was educated here. So our participation in Fire began with international connectathons and workgroup meetings, championed initially by HL7 New Zealand Chair Emeritus David Hay, and subsequently HL7 New Zealand has held education events dedicated to Fire, 2 or 3 of these a year ever since. We've also run a series of local connectathons and hackathons. The Fire Standard was endorsed by our Health Information Standards Organisation, HISO, at quite an early stage. There have been a number of sandbox implementations, for example, the terminology directory and conformance server that's used in a lot of international connectathons. And we have a Kiwis on Fire page in our HL7 New Zealand affiliate website. Where are we now? Well, we're building a community of implementers, particularly organisational members of HL7 New Zealand and some individual members who are actively involved in fire implementation and looking at their shared experiences and bringing this community approach and consensus towards developing some national fire artifacts, such as a base fire implementation guide, which is under development by an HL7 New Zealand work group. HISO has recently published an interoperability roadmap, which is very helpful in terms of declaring that they wish to build an API infrastructure as part of our digital health system, mainly using the Fire Standard. And also as parties to the Fire Community process, they'll use the International Patient Summary Implementation Guide and related specifications. This is a very clear and excellent direction of travel for New Zealand. And in terms of national projects, Fire APIs are being developed for our national patient and provider directory services, which are key building blocks for all of our systems, all our digital health systems. And we have a National Health Information Platform project underway, which I'll speak about a bit later. I've put the interoperability roadmap up here. It's a 2-year roadmap. It's a bit too detailed, and time constraints permit me from going through it bit by bit. Suffice to say, there are a lot of FHIR logos that I've superimposed on this because there are great dependencies on FHIR APIs. So FHIR is a critical element in this roadmap. The NHIP project is a wide-ranging program involving the creation of various digital products and services to enable access to individuals' health information throughout the healthcare system. This was endorsed by the final report of the New Zealand Health and Disability System Review recently, saying this platform will provide a powerful tool for data integration and interoperability across the entire system. It will also deliver a marketplace of application programming interfaces, APIs, and a developer portal to encourage the use of health information and the publishing of APIs. And these APIs will be developed using the HL7 FHIR standard. Now, the detailed business case for this is due to be delivered to the New Zealand Cabinet shortly. We've just had a general election. The government was returned with a working majority, and we expect to hear some good news regarding this fairly shortly. So what have we learned to date? Certainly, the need to create consensus is still there, as with any interoperability project, even more so with a comprehensive platform standard specifications such as FHIR. And this involves some cultural changes, the view that data entered into healthcare systems will be used throughout the system by various apps, patient, provider, system-facing apps, all the way down to use for analytics, clinical decision support, service reviews. But it means that the implementers must work together to create standards and implementations of those standards that everyone has buy-in to. We have some infrastructure challenges, in particularly on-premise IT in a lot of primary care facilities, general practices and pharmacies, for example. We found a lot of people asking questions about converting from pre-existing HL7 standards, version 2 messaging, CDA documents, and we're encouraging people to look at their underlying information models. This has been particularly helpful in some conversions of CDA to FHIR, to use the information models on which we base the CDA rendering. Various degrees of success in success in implementing the FHIR resource model. Some of the things such as referencing and the grouping resources has been a little bit of a challenge for some people to get hold of. Terminology is always a big challenge and incredibly important in terms of facilitating semantic interoperability. We definitely strongly advise people to look closely at the binding levels on all the coding data types in the FHIR resources. The use of local codes is obviously a barrier, and that is a challenge for us in some areas, notably pathology reporting. We don't as yet have a national terminology service. Hopefully we will have one in due course, but that is certainly a constraint for some of the validation now, particularly around publishing implementation guides. The use of URIs and URLs, particularly resolvable URLs for structured definitions, notably extensions, that's something that we find a challenge. I mean, as a general observation, it requires some upskilling and certain amount of education required to build up the skill levels within our domain. We're finding, for example, that business analysts find it quite difficult to get a foothold into FHIR. They've previously been used to creating IGs using Word and PDFs, etc. Now they've got to get used to profiling tools, possibly FHIR shorthand language, etc. Well, hopefully that's been a useful and informative oversight, brief oversight into the implementation of FHIR in New Zealand. During the course of this event, you can reach me in the following places, obviously on the FHIR app via the speakers gallery, via email, Skype, or Zulip. I'm available on those during all my waking hours generally. And I look forward to hearing any questions that you may have following the presentation. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Peter. Let's proceed to the Q&A at this stage.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Feed them through.
Yeah, our first question. Let's have a look. Is there a Maori name for the West Island? That's from Graham.
One, I thought it might be. Google is your friend, Graham. Next question.
Okay, next question. What sticks, if any, do the Minister of Health in New Zealand have and are prepared to use over the next couple of years for the laggards in the FHIR Interoperability Roadmap of New Zealand?
Culturally, we've not been very strong on the carrot and stick approach to standards, but there are promises and noises being made that there will be certification and that we'll have a digital health API ecosystem and products and suppliers will be certified to participate in that. But nothing more than that. We'll see how that eventuates. But it'll be surprising to see legislation such as there's been in the United States with the ONC regulations and the 21st Century Cures Act. That would surprise me. Although some may say we might need it to give patients access to their health records via standards compliant APIs. But the answer to that one's blowing in the wind still, I think.
Okay, super, thanks. The next question, are there sectors of the New Zealand healthcare system that you haven't been able to get traction with, or that you wish you could get more traction with?
I wish we could get more traction with allied health, pharmacists, podiatrists, physios, etc., etc. That's a big untapped area for interoperability and integration. And a lot of healthcare data resides in those systems. I mean, we tend to think a lot about general practices, pharmacies, and secondary care hospitals, and those systems and the data flows between them. But I think that certainly allied health is a big untapped market.
Okay, the next question. How is New Zealand handling medications and e-prescriptions? Any medication standard or national codes?
We have a national e-prescription service, and I've been working on that project for 10 years, and we've finally got, due to a pandemic, adoption amongst general practices up to 85%, and all the pharmacies, community pharmacists, have adopted it. It's predicated on some standards, CDA, the payloads are CDA, because we did start this 10 years ago, and we have a national medicines terminology, New Zealand medicines terminology. It's SNOMED compliant, but not as yet anyway, a national extension to SNOMED CT, which is what they've done in Australia with their medicines terminology. But it is mandatory to use that New Zealand medicines terminology within the national e-prescription service. So that's, and I've done some work recently to map the data model for the New Zealand prescription service to FHIR resources, and there's a demonstration on my client server of how that's done. So yes, I think we're in a good place as far as medications is concerned, but we've got a huge transactional repository of medications, and I'm hoping that we're going to make those available to the sector as a whole beyond that particular use case via FHIR API and supply FHIR payloads, because that's what the consumers want of apps. They want FHIR payloads. They don't want CDA documents.
Okay. we have a question again from Graham. Your comments about analysts and upskilling to FHIR was interesting. Is it necessary for them to produce fully structured IGs? They could still do Word documents, right?
Well, they could, but I just, my assumption may be incorrect, is that we've been encouraged to produce IGs as FHIR resources that can be rendered in the various ways of the tooling. And I generally think it's a bit of a tooling challenge. We should be able to go that way. I mean, Word documents aren't so good for people to put up on the internet and do searching for and hyperlinking and stuff. And they tend to be more static. I mean, you can keep revising them, but it's much easier to revise web pages. But I feel I'm rather preaching to the converted there with Graham. I think it is a tooling challenge. FHIR shorthand, I think, has been very good at making the cognoscenti more productive. I'm not sure whether it's actually increased the size of the pool of people who can create IGs, and that's why I think it's one of the challenges. But I certainly I've heard that from quite a few business analysts in New Zealand, that they find it hard to get a foothold into FHIR because they view it as a fairly technical standard. But that challenge may lessen with time and upskilling and tooling.
Okay, thank you. You talked about learning curve difficulties around IG, canonical URL resolution, validation, and modeling. Aside from tooling, Simplifier, and Sushi, how did you manage problem solving?
I use a number of tools. I've developed a FHIR terminology server, and it's just an exemplar for the New Zealand sector. It's got quite a lot of code systems and value sets on it. I did a lot of work with one of the test platforms, learned a lot about FHIR through that very atomic and well presented reporting of my various sins in the early days. So I do encourage people to use all the validation tools. I mean, I just watched an excellent session about FHIR validation from Graham, but I've used all the testing platforms there are, and I look forward to the new one that HL7 International and Graham's team are producing, which puts a nice UI over the FHIR validator. But I think validation and testing is incredibly important. I'm a great believer in test-driven development. So any tool that helps me to test it. And the other thing is the use of software libraries, such as I'm a .NET developer and I use the C# library, but I think that they're a major aid to getting consistent and conformant implementations if people use the tooling wherever, tried and tested tooling wherever possible.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. I don't see any new questions arrived. Oh yeah, I have another one here from Jim Steele. Are there sectors of the New Zealand healthcare system that you haven't been able to get traction with? Yeah, we've seen that one, all right.
Yeah, I talked about allied health on that one.
Yeah.
I mean, hospital systems are secondary care is another area where we're probably the converse of many countries where they've got more advanced IT in secondary care than they have in primary care. I think we've always been the other way around. We've got more advanced primary care systems and more integration in primary care than we have in secondary care in New Zealand.
Okay, super. Yeah, I think we've covered most of the questions. We've got, is there anything else you want to cover before we wrap up the session, Peter?
No, I just thank everyone who's attended, whether it's early in the morning for them or late in the evening or a normal time. And I'm happy to take more questions on Hoover and maybe think about some better replies to the ones I've already answered. But I won't answer the one about the Maori name for New Zealand.
Okay, super. Yeah, I think we're going to
Maori name for Australia. I can think of a few English names for Australia because for not marrying names.
Okay, super. All right, Peter. I think we're getting to the end of the session. Thank you again for participating in your presentation. Delegates, we hope you found the session useful. Please do not forget to rate this presentation and use the Q&A function if you still have questions. Thanks for attending, and goodbye, and have a nice day. Cheers for now.
Well,